All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Thursday, January 30th. Whew, I'm making it to the end of the week here.
Yeah, you almost didn't. I think this was going to come out in February, actually. This will be probably our first February episode. I think it's going to come out Monday, February 3rd. So, Ricky, it's good to have you here. We didn't get an episode last week because, as a new dad, with a daughter that's now out in the world, it seems like you caught a little sickness last week.
Yeah, I haven't I feel like we've skipped out on a couple parental updates, so I will say that this was my first experience with two parents down and out. We both got the Nora. I'll spare everyone the graphic details, but
Yeah.
let's say like a scene out of The Exorcist over here. And our daughter didn't get it, which, well, we think she may have had it in December, but neither of us got it then, but we both got it at the same time this week. And woof, I have a whole new respect for parents in general. I think about like my parents, and I don't really remember them being
Ever
sick.
being sick, ever.
Yeah.
They were never, and
They were
obviously that's not true, but they were never sick, right?
Yeah, exactly in my mind. And I'm like, I mean, this is another one, just credit to my wife who's amazing, powered through. Like I powered through by kind of just like trying to occupy Millie with Cheerios and things while I just like lay in pain and tried my hardest not to race to the bathroom. Like Ginny actually did real parenting things and was uh like severely down and out for a 24-hour period. But anyways, speaking of, lack of energy,
Ah, wow, you're stealing my puns, Ricky. You're 2025. You're going to be the pun guy now. Yeah.
right off the dome too. I don't even write these guys out.
Well done. Yes. So what we're going to talk about this week is nuclear energy in particular and this kind of period of energy transition that we're really in the midst of, maybe at the beginning of. In general, we're going to be joined by Suriya Jayanti, and we'll give her a full bio when she comes on. But I would say safe to say that she is an expert in her field, um, kind of both with the intricacies of energy and also someone in the politics and policies of energy. So I'm really excited to have her on and get to learn from her. I will say a couple of things. One, obviously, there's a ton going on politically here in the United States. Like it's almost impossible to keep up with the amount of executive orders that have flown out of the White House in the past 10 days. It feels like your phone throughout the day, your phone's blowing up. Every morning you wake up and it's stuff about immigration or foreign aid or federal funding or DI stuff, and you have all the Senate confirmations happening. And look, we're going to talk plenty about all of those things over the course of this Trump presidency. But what Ricky, we've also said is that we don't want to be just like held hostage by the Trump presidency and just kind of every week that we sit here and just react to the latest thing that he did or that the latest thing that this administration did, good or bad or indifferent or ambiguous. So we still want to use this to talk about like bigger issues that we are interested in, want to learn more about, just like when we did the antitrust episode with Bob Levy a couple weeks ago. Like I learned a lot from that, and we're hopeful that we can learn a lot from this episode about nuclear power, and also hope the listeners out there learn a lot as well. I guess last thing I'll say is we're recording this the day after a tragic plane crash here in Washington, D.C., where I think in like 67 people might have died, and just awful anytime this happens anywhere in the world, Ricky. But sometimes it seems really far away and that it can't happen here, and it hadn't happened here in the United States for so long, which a lot of good work and a lot of good luck, but super sad. It seems like a lot of young people, a lot of young figure skaters in particular, including from up here on the skating club in Boston, had a few members there. So while I'm sure there'll be investigations done for the causes of everything, I'm certainly thinking about all of those people and their families. Just kind of wanted, it's a somber note, but just did want to acknowledge that we're recording the day after. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. It's yeah, whenever something like this happens, it really makes you think.
Yeah, we're super lucky to be alive and lucky that we get to do, have conversations like this and have get to talk to people like Surya. So on that note, let's bring Surya. All right, we are now thrilled to welcome to the program Suriya Jayanti, who is a decorated energy legal and policy expert who has over 15 years of experience leading engagement with and representing the highest level governmental and energy sector interests. This includes 10 years as a U.S. diplomat at the U.S. State Department, including assignments in Kuwait, the Bahamas, Iraq, and in D.C. Suri also served as the U.S. Energy, Cybersecurity, Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Chief in Kiev, Ukraine from 2018 to 2020. Prior to that, she served as the International Energy Council at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and she worked as an attorney in Brussels and in Washington, D.C. She is committed to the energy transition, has worked with governments and companies all over the world to help them achieve their energy and decarbonization goals. So we couldn't ask for anybody better to talk about the future of energy and this energy transition. So, Surya, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure and a privilege, and I look forward to our conversation.
So do we. We're really excited to learn from you tonight. And you have written for publications all over the globe, really, on energy. And but the one that kind of caught my attention within the last year was an article you wrote in December of 2023 for Time. And the title of that article was Nuclear Power is the Only Solution. And you may or may not have had a hand in that title, but if I had to ask you about it, nuclear power is the only solution to what?
So at the moment, right, we're trying to balance a number of different competing things, and especially at a moment of political transition like this, and with a world that I think we could safely call slightly unstable. Energy plays a really big part in that. And we are looking at climate change. It's very clearly real. We do have large swaths of the US on fire or under hurricane chaos more or less every year now, and for large parts of the year. At the same time, though, we have economies and we have families to feed and we have jobs we have to get to. And that's just talking about the US domestically. Once you start looking at international, you're dealing with countries that feel very much that they have the right to be developing. You're looking at the fact that large swaths of Africa still have no electricity, or that parts of India, people are still burning dung in order to cook their food. And so the energy transition, it isn't what it is sometimes cast as, which is this boogeyman of trying to keep people down for the sake of the environment. It really is the notion of a balance. It's the notion of a transition that somehow finds not the best way, but the least worst way through a really difficult collection of needs and interests and priorities that we have to balance in order to make it work. And it's always going to be a compromise, and it's always going to probably not do enough of anything on any side because those needs are huge, right? So that's what nuclear is the only solution to. On one hand, it is the only energy source that can actually provide large populations with not just electricity, but also heating, with the capacity to have functioning economies, with the ability to have 5G broadband internet so that people can actually join the modern era, and that is carbon neutral. In fact, it's just carbon zero. It doesn't mean it's environmentally non-existent as a footprint, because of course you have to get into the questions of mining, and there are supply chains and of course spent fuel discussions. But the bottom line is the only energy source that, or rather, the energy source that best balances, and I would go so far as to say the only one that successfully balances the human energy need and the economic energy need with climate reality, is nuclear.
I definitely like that phrase, the sort of the best, least worst option. I wanted to touch on something that you sort of started as part of the preface, which was just the just general instability within the world right now. Given that and the way that nuclear power and nuclear weapons kind of they don't, while they don't go hand in hand, there is like a bit of a relationship there. I guess how are you thinking about where you would expect to see nuclear fill this role? Is it everywhere?
Honestly, in the long run, I don't think humanity has much of a choice. And that's not just a question of destroying the planet to the point at which it's not great for us to live on anymore, which is a bit of an inevitability on the course that we're on. But the difference between, for our audience, the difference between weapons grade uranium and what's generally referred to as civil nuclear, civilian nuclear power, is quite a high enrichment differential. So although ultimately the technology is no different because either you enrich it to 5% or you enrich it to 20% or you enrich it to 80%, the enrichment itself is the same technology, which is why countries are busily monitoring what Iran is doing with its nuclear programs, because once they can enrich it to power grade, to fuel grade, then they, in theory, can enrich it quite easily to weapons grade. So there is that link. That said, from a power perspective, everywhere on Earth needs nuclear, and it just does. There are a few countries that have enough of an alternative that they might be able to avoid nuclear, but they tend to be small. So you look at somewhere like Albania, and Albania is almost entirely hydro. You look at a place like Canada. Canada could be, in theory, almost entirely hydro. Canada is also a strong nuclear country, though, from a power perspective. So there isn't as firm a line between those two worlds. Your question ultimately, though, right, was one about national security and global security. And if I read between those lines, it's do we really want everyone to have nuclear power? Do we want North Korea to know how to enrich uranium? And the answer to that is I think that cat might be out of the bag. So China is currently leading the world on nuclear power. China has dozens of reactors currently in development. There are 60 some around the world that are currently being constructed. The plurality, if not the majority of those are in China. China already has an advanced reactor, meaning it's no longer using traditional technologies like the water cooling systems that have been at play in most of the reactors in the world thus far. It's already got it's already licensed an advanced reactor. It also already has a small modular reactor online, not just licensed and under construction. It's going. And countries like the United States or the United Kingdom are seriously behind. So, as much as I think it's an important question, I also think it's an important question that should have been asked 30 years ago. And at this point, these are the cards we've got, so we had better get on with winning the poker tournament, or in this case, the nuclear tournament, because right now we're losing. And countries that at least we in the United States tend to have reservations about from a national security perspective, Russia, China, are winning. And that's just the numbers are clear. We're far behind. So it would be nice to have the luxury of worrying about national security, but right now we have to worry about the fact that our national security is compromised by non-friendly nations being that much better at a critical function than we. So, no, I'm not particularly worried because I would already not be able to sleep at night because we're here. The truth is upon us.
That's fair. I think accepting kind of the reality of climate change and then making the decision based on the solutions available is what you have to do. Unfortunately, what we're unable to do. I guess maybe the other sort of the I think you touched on the nuclear waste issue, and if you have additional thoughts on that, I'm super curious about it. But the other thing that comes up here in the US is just how astronomically expensive it is to develop nuclear. Now, obviously, you gave some other examples like China, who I'm sure doing it at least on paper, much more cheaply. I'm curious, just your thoughts on A, is it actually that expensive, or is it onerous regulations and other things that are holdovers from kind of a bygone era of anti-nuclear that are driving costs the way that they are, at least cost projections?
That is the single best question you could ask in the American context, at least the second one. The first one is a globally important question. I'll answer the first one first because it's really easy. Everyone's worried about nuclear waste, but it's only waste if you waste it. And most of it can be recycled. You can take spent fuel and recycle it up to about, if you're lucky, maybe 80–85%. So you're really not looking at very much that then has to be buried somewhere. Meanwhile, the technologies for how to store spent fuel are improving every day. There are some fantastic ones that deal with mile deep boreholes and special canisters. There are a number of really good ideas, and some of the newer designs of nuclear reactors use less fuel, specially fabricated at certain enrichment levels that allow the quantity of fuel necessary to be pretty low. And in fact, the amount of uranium fuel that is necessary to power your entire life would fit in a soda can. That's all it takes. And so we're not talking about a ton of waste here. Canada has an SMR, a small modular reactor company called Moltex, which I love to pick on because this is the coolest thing ever. They are designing a small modular nuclear reactor that essentially recycles its own fuel. It is basically a closed circuit. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly, which means from the perspective of a human lifespan, it can kind of just keep powering itself almost indefinitely. And meanwhile, you have close to no spent fuel problems. The other issue with spent fuel is the fuel itself, I don't think is particularly difficult to store, right? Dig a hole, put it in. The problem is that the way a lot of us have been doing it is you dig a pond and put it in the pond to cool for 10 years before you can then bury it. Well, that's what Ukraine has been doing, for example. And then in comes Russia and starts blowing up all the ponds. And suddenly you have everyone freaking out about the possibility of a nuclear disaster. And then Russia blows up the hydroelectric plant, the dam that was making the giant reservoir from where the water was coming to cool the power plant and to cool the nuclear reactors and the spent fuel. And suddenly we have a problem. So the fuel itself, the spent fuel, isn't much of a problem. Being dumb about it, either on the side of the design of the plant, or because we aren't recycling it, or because we do dumb things like send rockets at the spent fuel pools, those are the problems. But it's really an us problem. It's not a nuclear problem. This is a question of human behavior and failures of human governance. So again, it's only waste if you waste it, and there are myriad different uses for spent fuel in the medical sectors, for example, etc. As to the question of money, so the United States has what I like to describe as an abstinence-only approach to nuclear. That everybody after 3 Mile Island in the late 70s got super freaked out about nuclear. I'd like to point out nobody died. It was really a very small problem. But everyone got super freaked out. Possibly some international disinformation trying to sow instability inside the United States. I have heard tell of it. And the consequence is that we have a set of regulations that make it pretty much impossible to build nuclear. And the great thing about abstinence is, of course, you're not going to get an STD, but you're also not getting laid. And that's how we as a country are handling nuclear. We are virgin clean and don't have nuclear power. I'm exaggerating slightly because, of course, there are legacy nuclear power plants in the US, and we have managed to build one new one in the last 50 years, Vogtle. Now, Vogtle was supposed to be a fairly cheap, fairly fast project. It ended up taking 35 years, and it cost $35 billion. That is astonishing. Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the one we've all been reading about over and over again, was built in 36 months, and it's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. China and Korea are delivering nuclear power plants on time and on budget in under 5 years. So it's a US problem. It's not exclusively the US. It's also, for example, the United Kingdom and a few other Western countries, but it is principally the United States that is incapable of doing this at a reasonable cost and on a reasonable time frame. Partly, it's because our regulatory system kind of goes for no risk as its benchmark. And the problem with no risk is nothing has no risk. And another part of the problem is there are two ways that nuclear licensing regimes tend to function, sort of ideologically, but also to some extent procedurally. And one is that you set a safety threshold. So let's say it has to be 98% absolutely safe. And then what you do is you have the applicants for a nuclear license prove to you that whatever it is they're planning to build, whichever model, whichever technology, in whichever location, with whichever operator, can reach that safety threshold, but you don't prescribe how it has to be reached. What's great about that system is that it means it's flexible. It can adapt to new technologies. It can adapt to locations that, for example, don't have seismic concerns, and therefore you don't need that depth of seismic study, or you don't need cushions put under the power plant to make sure that if there's an earthquake, they don't wobble too much. And therefore, you allow theoretically for licensing to happen in a way that is flexible and somewhat tailored to and tailored by the applicant. The US does not have that system. The US has the equivalent of a check the box system. So you need 15 widgets of the X type, and you need 15 widgets of the Y type, and you need 10 operating staff members with the following degrees to operate the X widgets, and you need the following degrees on 10 other staff members to operate the Y, right? I'm obviously making this up for the sake of simplification. And you don't get a license unless every one of those boxes is checked. And that's ridiculous because as new technologies come online, many of those existing requirements don't apply or can be done better in a different way. And so we essentially have a system that can only license one kind of reactor. I don't necessarily mean one brand, but one nuclear technology, and has to be redone for every single reactor because you can't really modulate it, and takes an insane amount of time and an insane amount of paperwork, adds, in some cases, decades to the amount of time it takes to get approval to build. So one of the reasons Vogtle took so long is that September 11th happened, and all of the regulations suddenly now required that the nuclear plant be airplane resistant. Okay, fair enough. But then Fukushima happens in 2011. And suddenly we revise all of our regulations to now require that it be tsunami resistant. And I don't know about you, but I don't recall a time a tsunami hit central Georgia. I could be wrong. My geography is not that good. But I'm reasonably sure that those are not necessarily requirements, or at least the one about coastal flooding, to a plant that isn't on the coast. And yet the way that the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission functions and the procedures it has, it's going to apply coastal requirements to a mountain construction site because it has no ability to differentiate and be flexible. Congress did try to prod the NRC to improve slightly. It did actually pass a law telling the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to find a way to simplify the licensing process for small modular nuclear reactors and advanced reactors so that we could get out of this tripping over our own feet problem that we have as a country when it comes to nuclear regulation. This is how that went. The original regs were 600 pages. So the people at the NRC tasked with coming up with new regulations for this new class of nuclear in order to help facilitate it becoming a reality took those original 600 pages and added 600 pages of new regulations on top of it. So now, and this is draft form, but now what they had was double the length with a whole bunch of things that don't apply to SMRs and don't necessarily apply to advanced reactors. Some cases internally inconsistent, as in you can't satisfy provision 17 and provision 242. I'm making up numbers, but it's that kind of thing. So there's no way of actually having it work. That's, I hope, not the best we can do, but it might mean that in order to get nuclear properly kickstarted in this country, we need to functionally raise the NRC, delete all of our regulations, and start again from a perspective that isn't anti-nuclear, because our existing structure is anti-nuclear and it adds years, if not decades. And with years and decades, you're looking at billions and billions and billions of additional costs. And that is why things don't function here from a nuclear perspective.
Well, sticking here with the United States from more of a politics perspective, Democrats have been in power for 12 of the last 16 years here, and a central tenet of that platform has been climate change. And the climate change is an existential threat, and we need to transition, under the Biden administration. We have, the electric cars and increase in solar power and wind turbines. And Republicans have, you could also say Republicans have been in power for, 12 of the last 24 years. And, now that we have President Trump back in power, talking about this golden age of American energy and energy independence. And so we have problems or kind of issues that are identified by both sides of the political spectrum with climate change and energy development and energy revolution. And yet neither party seems to be talking about nuclear power. Why not?
So I'm not sure I entirely agree. By which I mean, I don't know that either party has made nuclear power an integral part of its platform. Sure. But I think there are plenty of people on both sides who are championing nuclear power. Uh, that there have been a number of bills that have come out of Congress, regardless, or rather at times when it has been Democrat controlled and at times when it's been Republican controlled, that are created with an eye towards facilitating and accelerating the nuclear industry, nuclear technology development, et cetera. Under the last administration, Biden's administration, quite a lot of money was put into nuclear. Quite a lot of money was sent out from the Department of Energy to a number of different nuclear startups, principally one called NuScale, which has had some struggles. Quite a few of the companies have had struggles, that SMRs in general are hitting a few roadblocks, mostly to do with the designs being a bit late relative to what we were all hoping for, also due to costs, and also due to regulatory hurdles. So it's by no means exclusive to NuScale. It's just that NuScale fell the hardest and fell the furthest, and is now facing quite a number of investor fraud lawsuits as a consequence. But in the meantime, they were given $1 billion by the US government and promises of more. So that's quite a lot of money. There are a number of loan programs, a lot of them coming out of DOE. There are a number of technical assistance grants. So the Nuclear Bureau at the State Department has been working with mainly US TDA, the Trade and Development Administration, to fund feasibility studies in target countries, a lot of them in Central Europe, to help get them ready for nuclear, places like Poland, which has never had a nuclear power plant. And that's in the tens of millions of dollars that have gone into it. And I would say absolutely there are champions on both sides of the aisle. I think it's easy to assume that on the Democratic side, everybody is just pro wind and solar and maybe hydro, although then they have dams and dams are bad. So maybe just wind and solar. And that on the Republican side, everybody's just drill, baby, drill. And but actually, as a practical matter, I don't think that that's how it has or will pan out. I do think anybody who understands the energy market is pretty much pro-nuclear, especially as wind and solar, if you factor in what's necessary to make them function at grid scale, also known as battery storage systems, so that you can use them so that you're not looking at a disruption in the ability to balance the grid if, for example, the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. Texas, for example, has caught on to this, given its energy crises in the last few years. When you factor the price of the batteries in, wind and solar become much more expensive than nuclear. And when you factor in supply chain issues and critical minerals, for example, that China has decided to ban, then the alternatives to nuclear are much harder to not so much defend, but much harder to promote as the only option. And my experience has been that everybody begins to realize that the only technology that can power us and heat us at scale is nuclear.
Well, that makes me feel better. Like that's a really nice, hopeful kind of outlook on it. But you know better, certainly way better than we do, that nuclear energy, in terms of like the number of nuclear reactors here in the United States, peaked in I think 1990 and has been on a steady decline since then. Right, we only named one that has come online recently, and three times that have closed recently. So, do you think like there's hope realistically for kind of a nuclear revival here in the United States? And if so, like where are we looking for that hope?
Hope. Well, I have to have hope, partly because I run a nuclear company, although my company does not work in the United States, and that's for all of the obvious aforementioned reasons. It's unnavigable, and it's extremely expensive. But I do have hope. No, I do. Partly because I don't think we have much of a choice. But it might well be that the United States brings up the rear, that our luxury of energy richness and independence also means we have less of an immediate imperative. You look at a country like Poland, which was entirely dependent on natural gas from Russia and coal, and Poland has to comply with EU climate change and energy transition requirements, as well as EU antitrust rules about energy markets, which also affect a lot of this. And now Russia invades Ukraine, and there's an entirely predictable energy crisis. And Poland's in a lot of trouble energy wise. Boom, nuclear becomes really, really important for it. So I think there are many countries that will beat us to it, partly as a function of our permitting process being so difficult, just in general for any kind of big infrastructure. The NIMBYism here is a major hurdle. And now you add my abstinence only descriptor to our regulatory process here. And now you add triply the fact that we aren't in any immediate urgency for nuclear at present because we have so much oil and gas. We have so much solar potential in the Southwest, so much wind potential up either of the coasts. So I think we're moving slowly. And I think I do have hope, but I believe the United States will be pretty much at the back of the pack.
Yeah, that's fair. I saw a poll from Pew in August of last year that said I think 56% of Americans were pro like more nuclear energy, which surprised me at how high it was because I think for me and most people I know, when you hear nuclear energy, you think of Fukushima, you think of Three Mile, you think of Chernobyl. So I wonder, as a leader of a nuclear energy company, how do you go about messaging nuclear power, like the safety of nuclear power, because I think people immediately their minds jump to these worst case terrible scenarios. But and I don't want to minimize that these were, devastating kind of events in their respective regions. But if you kind of compare that to like deaths or money that comes from natural disasters that we have here all the time, uh, you start to kind of weigh them. But I do feel like in people's imagination, nuclear power is incredibly dangerous.
It's big and it's scary. It's sort of the stuff of nightmares, right? Except as a practical matter, it's just not. So, for example, one of the things that I will tell people is I'll actually tell them the numbers. Nobody died from Three Mile Island. Nobody died directly from Fukushima. Chernobyl, a handful of people died, and those were the first responders. But really, the numbers are very small. You compare that to the number of people who are dying of lung cancer and asthma-related issues from car exhaust or from burning dung to cook food, or the number of people who are suffering in other ways from other water contamination from fracking hitting wells, things like that. And wind and solar are also not particularly shiny, squeaky clean. There's a great deal of toxicity in a lot of that equipment and a lot of the minerals that are used and metals and rare earths that go into that. On balance, nuclear numerically is really the safest. It is only in our worst imagination that it becomes that dangerous. The second thing I like to tell people is that we're not talking about your great grandmother's nuclear power plants anymore. The newer designs are really cool and they have a lot of innovations built into them that really substantially lower the threat profile rather, to what I think is a very acceptable threshold. Now, sure, we can disagree about what is an acceptable threshold, but if it's a choice between that and dying of an asthma attack, because I'm from Los Angeles and I grew up with 80 smog alert days a year, I'm going to take the incredibly remote risk of nuclear. Uh, so some of those design features, for example, are cooling systems that don't depend on external water sources so that you aren't looking at what happened with Fukushima or what people are scared of with respect to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. Those are not actually concerns about the power plant itself. Those are concerns about the failure of the cooling system. So Fukushima, it was that the tsunami took out the cooling system. In Zaporizhia, Russia has consistently blown up the power system that goes to the cooling system for that plant and then blew up the water source itself, caused its own ecological disaster by doing that, but also meant that the plant doesn't have water. Now, that plant has now been shut down, but of course, it takes a very long time to cool down. But the other thing is that you can just build the reactors differently. So, for example, there is no risk of Zaporizhia ever being a Chernobyl style disaster. And that's simply because it doesn't have material that burns in its reactor core. It has water in its reactor core. So just that one generational development in what is otherwise a very similar power plant means that you're not looking at a risk of a meltdown in anything resembling the same manner. SMRs, they're small. And so just the physics, the geometry of it is they're much safer. You're dealing with less fuel that has to be transported in fewer places, fewer ways. There are so many different small and also large design developments, supply chain developments, regulatory developments, spent fuel handling and storage developments. The risk is really low. It's really low. And it is definitely lower than the known risk of the alternative power sources to nuclear.
Yeah, I guess it is a little bit like a plane crash versus a number of flights a day.
Sure, or the odds of a car crash versus the odds of a plane crashing. Um, I remember someone telling me a joke once that there's a 1 in a million chance of there being a bomb on your airplane, and there's a 1 in a trillion chance of there being two bombs on your airplane, so you should bring your own bomb, which right. It's a statistics joke, obviously, but to some extent, right, the nuclear power plant really the odds of it having a problem are really remote, and it is easily the most regulated of any industry. Uh, the One of the biggest threats is actually just that we don't have enough people to fuel the nuclear renaissance, if we want to use that term. That countries like ours, where we haven't built a nuclear power plant, well, we built one, right? But in 50 years, where are all of these nuclear engineers? Where are all of the people, the technicians, the people who know how to actually cast and weld at a nuclear grade level and quality specification? There are people in other countries. Ukraine, for example, is full of people who know how to work in the nuclear industry. But there is a serious dearth of nuclear expertise, experience, and talent in a lot of other countries, ours included. And that means we have to be careful not to get ahead of ourselves and build things that we don't have the capacity to properly handle and keep it at quality grade.
Yeah, and interesting. I mean, just further kind of gets to your point around how we're falling behind and policies are kind of keeping us further behind. I'm curious, kind of, I guess, in that vein, I think there's obviously marketing that can be done that may turn public sentiment. Um, I feel like government postures are still even or just a different beast to change. I think you sort of touched on this already, but just the idea that right, Germany after Fukushima basically said no more nuclear. We've after Three Mile Island and one in just through the regulatory red tape have made it no more nuclear. Like how do you I guess despite the fact that maybe under the table or behind the curtain there's some acceptance in Washington that nuclear has to be part of the future, how do you see that like government outward facing posture changing and do you see any signs of that changing and how does that change, I guess, is the right question or the question I'm trying to ask.
I I honestly can't tell you what the Trump administration's thoughts on nuclear are or what they'll be. I I don't know.
If you
There,
could talk to him, you could probably tell him what his thoughts on nuclear.
well, I've spoken to a number of people close to him who are super pro-nuclear and are looking for ways to accelerate the United States, in part because any person who knows energy and is a thinking person ultimately gets to the point of realizing nuclear is the only option. Excuse me, that was a motorcycle going by. For the sake of clarity, I'll say it again, right? Like any person who really knows the energy markets and energy mix and energy systems, who is also a thinking person, eventually gets to the point of realizing nuclear is the only sustainable, scalable option for powering humanity. Uh, I have spoken to a number of people within Trump's orbit who 100% get that and absolutely want to see how we can get it done and are looking for ways to fix the NRC, fix the regulations, find risk balancing, risk sharing, including things like project finance mechanisms for doing this. I have no idea what Trump himself thinks on nuclear. I don't know that he's ever been particularly outspoken in any direction on it, but I don't think he's particularly hostile to it any more than he's particularly pro. So I think there's room for it to continue. I think it's important to remember that China is kicking our butt on nuclear. Um, it started by reverse engineering the Westinghouse AP 1000. So it's a standard. China steals the technology and then does it better than us at a manufacturing level. And that has to rankle. There's no way that the White House doesn't view that as a problem. They might not view it as a nuclear specific problem, but it's impossible to have China that far ahead of us and have Russia have a global stranglehold on fuel fabrication and enrichment and not view that as a considerable America First problem. And so I think there's room for hope in that respect. And I don't know that it requires a massive shift in policy. What it requires are a few things. One is we, not as a country, but we as a world, for the most part, except in countries where the nuclear sector is entirely state-owned, have not found a way to balance and share risk among the different parties to a nuclear power plant development project. If we don't have public-private partnerships that have worked out how the government can protect the private investors and how the private investors can take some of the risk out of bottomless taxpayer dollar liability, those need to get worked out. Those are active conversations happening in the nuclear industry, but nobody has a particularly good solution yet. And then the next thing that needs to happen is that we really do need to get a lot of the rules out of the way and a lot of the red tape out of the way. Permitting problems, siting problems, NIMBYism problems. And then you get to advanced reactors, which on one hand are moving really slowly because everybody's scared of them because it's new and they don't know, and oh my goodness, and it could be, but on the other hand, are, according to the physics and therefore probably the design, significantly safer than traditional old-fashioned pressurized water reactor designs. So it's a little bit strange that the technologies that should allow us to move faster are in fact proving twice as hard to bring into reality. And we have to find a way forward. And I'm not sure I'm advocating for this, but having been a bureaucrat for a really long time, I don't know how you change bureaucratic culture fast enough and the regulations that go with it fast enough to allow us to pick up speed anytime soon, unless you just delete all and start again. I don't see any particular movement in that direction, although those conversations are also underway. But obviously, it becomes legally complicated because what do you do with the nuclear reactors that are currently operating under NRC licenses with specific rules, et cetera? I don't know if you create a forward-looking new nuclear agency that is dealing with new things and just leave the NRC to deal with the old things and then gradually let it die out as they die out. I don't know, but it is something that needs to be happening, needs to be discussed at a policy level, is being discussed. We will see if this administration has the disruption appetite to tackle the NRC. I will say it does appear that they are not short of disruption appetite, for right or wrong. And I think we'll find out, won't we? And it might be a mixed bag. Some things that might go really well, and some things might be an absolute disaster. Nobody knows. We'll see how it goes. I, for one, have hope that a little bit of disruption could go really well in quite a few areas. And in nuclear, we just need to be careful that we're not disrupting safety, but are disrupting business models, regulatory obstacles, cultures that are social cultures that are scared of nuclear. We'll see. We'll see.
We'd be remiss in not asking a little bit about Ukraine, given that you spent 3 years in Ukraine and have mentioned it repeatedly as one of the really the leading drivers of nuclear energy and expertise in the world. And you mentioned how Russia's invasion of Ukraine in some ways was a positive for European nuclear development because it hastened like the need for alternative sources of energy because Europe was so reliant on Russian, liquid natural gas and like th those sorts of things. Uh, but you've also written about how Russia is really key to this kind of global, making this global energy transition in a clean, sustainable way, for a number of reasons. One, Russia, kind of behind China, is a leader in nuclear development, but they also have, I think, 8% of the world's uranium, and they have maybe something like 40% of like the kind of way you have to treat the uranium. So you can correct me on those figures, but this is one of those really modern problems that Ricky and I talk a lot about, where you have the world is so interconnected with things like climate change and energy that matters to like all of us. Like as humans, we all have to kind of, you would hope that we would work together to try to solve these problems. And yet, as humans, we also have these kind of we're like a nation state world where we have these territorial disputes and invasions and wars. Uh, that was a rambling long kind of question, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do you, as someone that's really literally like lived this life and energy in these spaces where this is all happening, try to reconcile those things where maybe we can all in this kind of agree that Russia is the bad actor in this situation, and yet Russia, acknowledging that Russia is still essential to these ultimate goals that would benefit all of humanity. I don't know.
What I'd really like is to be able to go back about 20, 30 years and get the US out of its own anti-nuclear hole so that it could begin doing the industry development, the supply chain development, the enrichment facility development that would allow for those numbers that you just cited not to be currently true. Because you're quite right. Russia has about a tenth, maybe even a little bit more of the world's uranium, known uranium, and it has about 42% of the world's enrichment capacity. And that is a really, really bad set of numbers if you are trying to develop your own nuclear industry without relying on Russia. And I think Russia has very much proven that it cannot be relied upon to play well with others in the sandbox. So in the nuclear sandbox, there are, however, other countries, sure. There are other countries with uranium, for example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine has uranium. It's not so much that there isn't uranium, it's that there isn't the existing fabrication, enrichment and fabrication infrastructure necessary in a lot of other countries. So, for example, TerraPower. TerraPower is Bill Gates's nuclear startup, and it's designing a pretty cool molten salt advanced reactor, what's also sometimes called Generation 4 reactor, Gen 4. And the fuel that they use is only made in Russia. And so that has set them back quite a few years. There has been quite a lot of money recently put in to the United States, but also in Europe and in the UK, into projects to develop our own enrichment capacity further so that we don't have to rely on Russia for so much of it. But these are things that do take a little bit of time and take a lot of money. But those efforts are underway. Russia is also super important for a couple of other things, though. So it's not just the uranium, it's also quite a few of the metals and minerals and rare earths that go into other parts of the energy transition. Nuclear is just one of the big ones. Russia is in a position to cause everyone quite a lot of pain as they flee Russian natural gas, although there's a whole lot less fleeing than they're used to. And in fact, Greenpeace published a report a couple months ago that Russian oil tankers are actually just pulling straight up into European ports. They're no longer even dropping their oil off in Abu Dhabi and having it refined there. They're just pulling straight into European ports. But between Russia and China, there is a massive stranglehold potential on pretty much all sources of energy except oil and gas. And that's and that's obviously because oil, that you have the Gulf countries and you have the United States and Canada and Venezuela and Brazil, etc. And natural gas, you have the United States principally, and Norway and Qatar. But between the two of them, the damage they can do economically and from an energy security perspective is massive. The US probably going to be fine because, again, we are energy independent. But a lot of the rest of the world remains quite vulnerable should the two of those countries choose to team up to make mischief together.
Well, fair enough. Sorry, we've kept you longer than we said we were going to, but this is exactly I think what we had hoped was going to happen is that it's so fascinating
Cool.
and I think there's so much to learn about it. If people are interested in learning more about nuclear energy in particular, or maybe just kind of like world energy in general, you've done writing about this subject. We really just scratched the surface of it. Where could people look to follow some of your stuff?
I publish with the Atlantic Council. Quite often, I'm a non-resident senior fellow there, and the Atlantic Council has an energy center that does a lot of super digestible energy policy publications. I tend to publish some of the less technical pieces in Time magazine, and those are free. Everybody has access to them. Time has been pretty good at covering a lot of the energy ups and downs over the last, let's call that 4 years now. The energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion, but also some of the Nord Stream 2 issues, for example, a little bit on nuclear as well. And Time's also pretty good at having pieces that get into the geopolitics of a lot of it. When I try to flatter myself, I like to describe myself as an energy geostrategist, which is a really pretentious way of saying I think that energy plays a really big role in international affairs and power dynamics. So I would, that's where my work tends to appear. I am perfectly happy to field questions if people have them. I have a website, it's suriyajayanti.com. There is a way you can email me on it. I'm also perfectly happy to do a follow-up should you want that. And I do think that energy is such an absolute sine qua non for all of our lives at this point that everybody should be basically conversant, right? Like we should all be able to calculate the tip at a restaurant and we should all be vaguely aware of how energy markets work. And if you know how to put gas in your car, you should know at least generally how energy works and how electricity switches turn on and off and why you're paying a given amount at a given moment. There are some places that have learned this the hard way, all of Europe in 2022, for example, Texas in cold winters, California in the era of Enron. People have learned a lot about this, but there is a great deal left to learn. And energy is fun because it's dynamic, it's interesting, and it's super important. And then if you feel like nerding out on it, there's also a ton of the nerdy stuff because ultimately it's a lot of physics. So anything from geopolitics to physics to just why is my bill so high? Strong recommendation that people dig a little bit into it. Nuclear is not just scary for people from a risk perspective, but in the same way that we would say, oh, it's not rocket science. Nuclear physicists are it's like the epitome of badass from a nerd smart perspective, and that can intimidate a lot of people. But ultimately, nuclear is pretty simple. It's the atoms going that way. And then it turns a generator, and then, like anything else, you get to play Xbox. So I strongly encourage people to dig into it a little bit. Energy is fun, and it's current, pun fully intended.
No, see, this is why you were perfect to have on. We wanted an energy geostrategist on. That you hit the intersection of all this stuff perfectly. You made it digestible. You made me personally more conversant in energy issues. So thank you for all that. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, we also do love a good pun on this show, so
Well, I'm not sure that was a good one, but
Yeah.
I offer you my best.
That's what I do to Ricky every week, and he shoots me down. So I appreciate it. He was far more complimentary to you than he always is to me. Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future.
yeah,
You for
pleasure
sure
mine.
will.
Thank you.
So again, a huge thanks to Sri. I said this that we kept her longer than we promised, but it was one of those conversations, Ricky, where I was learning so much and I just wanted to hear more from her. I do think she taught me she really was perfect because she could speak to like the geopolitical things like she was really throughout the conversation, but particularly at the end, but also speak more intricately about nuclear power and specifically or energy in general. So I I found it super valuable. And you're our resident energy guy here on the podcast. We do plenty of law things, Ricky, where it's a me show. But so what were some of your reactions to Surya in our conversation?
Yeah, I'm definitely not at that level. I mean, I I do think I'd say sort of where she ended this kind of the energy geopolitical strategist that is um where most of my like wheels like really started turning towards the end of this, just in terms of how we need to think about the future and kind of contextualizing even the past, right? I mean, the history book story of like American rise to kind of global preeminence is all about, we pick ourselves up from our bootstraps and we like work really hard and this, that, and the other thing, and presto changeo, all of a sudden we're the most powerful country in the world. But underlying that is obviously a history of free labor, slave labor, and then this massive explosion in first oil, then coal, then natural gas, just like all of these things that countries are paying 5 to 10x for, we just have an embarrassment of riches. But that's not just because things were true yesterday doesn't mean tomorrow and forever and ever. And I think this point about nuclear energy is really an interesting one to me because I think to a large extent she's right, and some other guests that we've had would argue the same that like yeah, U.S. natural gas it's going to run us for a long, long time. We're not desperate for anything. But that's kind of like this, like, the idea of empires that don't evolve and change because, like, look, we're sitting on something really good right now. Why would we move to something potentially more expensive when we have this thing that we have right now? And it's like, well, all these other places that don't have it are moving to this thing, but that's the new thing, maybe. I mean, it's like the new old thing, but you know what I'm trying to say. I think it's I don't know. It's food for thought. Like Trump talks a lot about energy independence as our national security goal, but he talks about it in the context of natural gas and oil. But those are both global commodities, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, the price of natural gas went up there, but it also goes up here because guess what? Our sellers aren't restricted to sell it here. They can sell it over there. They can liquefy it and ship it across the Atlantic, and we pay for that. So I don't know. It's interesting. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it was all really interesting, and that's what I liked about it. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at. And you had a similar question like that of why haven't we heard more explicitly nuclear power, right? We kind of heard, like I said, these big umbrella topics that the two parties are concerned about, but I just haven't heard nuclear power at the national level. And she's obviously way more tuned in. She worked at the State Department for 10 years, the Commerce Department. So she is hearing things that which is why she's such a great guest, hearing things that I certainly don't. And so it was somewhat heartening to hear that there are people kind of across the spectrum advocating for nuclear power behind the scenes, which is great. But I don't know, she seemed rarely do we have guests that are more hopeful than we are, but she seemed more hopeful about this than I am, just because I haven't heard a lot of nuclear power in the conversation. Like when we're talking about these national debates at the presidential level or the Senate level, it doesn't feel like anybody's really talking about it. And I think her point is because, and you were just talking about this, because we don't have to right now. But what's that? It's not very future forward looking, either to try to combat climate change or down the line where with energy independence, dependence on oil and natural gas. Like, yeah, you would hope that we would have it would enter the conversation, the zeitgeist a little bit more, because it does seem like that's like where we should be headed, and we don't want to be left behind for a lot of reasons. For a lot, yeah,
Well, I mean, it is also interesting, right? Like the countries that she pointed out, Russia, China, like these these are all places that don't operate with democracies. And besides being able to just pick and choose kind of which regulations they want to uphold and which ones they want to just like push on the wayside, if they decide, hey, this is something we're going to do it, and we can do it in 5 years or whatever. This kind of this notion of, yeah, I'm going to be in power for like 30, 40 years. So I'm going to start a project now and see it through to the end. How do democracies kind of compete with that? Because we're just short term in nature. Like the best thing about us is that we don't elect somebody to be president for 50 years, but it's got its drawbacks. And I think this is one of those areas where we just have to, it's a very tough sell. You cannot sell a more expensive technology when a cheaper alternative exists, despite what we know about like what it's doing to us in the long run.
Yeah. No, it's well said. It's reminiscent of the question you asked Charles Sykes when we were talking about Biden's legacy of, he chose to invest in these infrastructure projects which haven't yet paid dividends and potentially had cost them. Certainly not the only way it had cost them at the polls. But yeah, it's a good big picture question to perhaps wrap on. Any final thoughts on our conversation?
No, I think it's best we leave it there.
Yeah, yeah, but definitely something I'll be thinking about some of the things that she told us, and definitely keeping more of an eye out for headlines. Like I have been, because I've been thinking about this issue, and so whenever I see a headline, I mean, no matter where it comes from, I'm trying to read it. But now, especially now that I know a little bit more about it, I'll be even, extra eagle-eyed, Ricky.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously you stumped me when you asked me if I thought of anything more. And as soon as you started talking, I was like, shoot, that I
Yeah, yeah, no, of course.
so, and I'm kind of glad that we didn't get into this, obviously, because this is more along the lines of my direct industry involvement. And I don't talk much about that on this podcast, but this kind of we're in a new period in the United States of energy growth. And one of the other things that has really been an impediment for nuclear power is that energy demand has been relatively stagnant over, call it from 10, 11, 12 years, right? And now all of a sudden, AI, crypto, marijuana, like all electric vehicles, like one on top of the other, and our growth curves are going through the roof while we are somewhat, I think, somewhere, some people maybe coming to the realization that we should probably do something about climate change while California is on fire and the East Coast floods like literally 3 times a year. Some people are, I don't know. So, but meeting that challenge of, hey, industry has a lot of money to spend and they want to build things that are going to need a lot of power. And what is, one of the only ways that we can do that without adversely impacting the climate, might be nuclear.
That's a great place to end. I'm glad that you got it and triggered you. Well done.
Okay. We can actually leave it there now. Till next time, buddy.
I'll see you.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.